Hello, my name is Nanette Stahl, and I am the Joseph and Seal Mazer Librarian for Judaic Studies at the Yale University Library. And I'm talking to Mordecai Levy-Eichel, who is a graduate student at Yale in European history, early modern European history, with an affiliation with the Judaic Studies program as well. And I'm talking to Mordecai, whom everybody calls Mordu.
This is correct.
Because I'd like for him to tell us a little bit about his work here. And since I'm the librarian here, I would like to find out how, doing his graduate work, he has used the library to help him to do his research, and you're now in the process of writing your dissertation.
Correct.
So how have we been helpful to you? And in fact, if you have recommendations how we could do things better, that would also be appreciated.
Sure.
So why don't you start out, Mordecai, by telling us a little bit about, maybe about yourself, and also about your research, your interests, your scholarly work, and maybe a little bit about your dissertation.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you for having me, Nanette. So my name is Mordecai, and as Nanette mentions, most people call me Mordu, which is the traditional Sephardic Jewish nickname. I grew up in New York.
Are you a Sephardic background?
I am. My father's family comes from Çorlu, which is a little town outside of Istanbul. And my mother's family, although they came from Germany, were originally from Turkey as well. And of course, most of the Jews who came from Turkey themselves had come from Spain when they were kicked out in 1492. I grew up in New York City. I went to the University of Chicago as an undergrad, and I'm now a graduate student here at Yale. In particular, I study early modern European history, and my dissertation concerns changes in education, in particular the expansion of and religious and economic reactions to mathematics in early modern Europe. So I'm trying to think of the best way to briefly answer your question about the way the library has been helpful for my work, but sort of the thing is that the library is at the center of any graduate student or professor's work, just because most of what we do involves looking at books and getting other books and reading books and comparing the books with other books and archives. And Yale, in this regard, is one of the best libraries in America. It has, I think, the second largest private collection in the US. It has one of the greatest collections in various areas, including British history, certain aspects of Jewish history, and various other areas that I'm sure, unfamiliar with, but my friends no doubt use often. So I've used the Yale Library for a variety of ways, both in terms of research and in getting my research done. For research-wise, one of the nice things about Yale is that it's mostly open stack, so I've been able to get any book I need pretty easily by just going to the shelves and getting it, and when the book's not there, I can order it from the storage facility pretty quickly, and it comes very quickly. A room like this is actually enormously helpful. As Nanette said, we are in the Judaic Studies reading room, which is mostly a reference room, but is also big enough to occasionally function as a classroom, and small enough to also function as sort of a conference or study room. So classes happen here, but also I've used it, now that I'm writing my dissertation, regularly to have meetings with the people in my dissertation writing group. So a few of us get together and we go over each person's draft chapter, and this is a very nice setting and very easily to sort of just come in here and do it. It's also a great reference room in terms of having an enormous amount of primary sources easily available, which is one thing that any researcher needs. In terms of getting my research or getting the materials, there are just so many works here on the shelves that it's made it, I mean,
Meaning the library?
Meaning the library in general.
In
The library in general. When I've been abroad and doing research occasionally and I want to check something, it's I've often wished, in fact, to be back here in New Haven at the library because I can easily get access to something. So working here at Yale is extremely good for any graduate student or professor.
Tell me a little bit about your dissertation topic and where you're taking it.
Sure. So my dissertation concerns changes in education, and I came to this partly because, so I went to a Jewish day school for 8 years, and then I was in fact homeschooled before I went to the University of Chicago. And the University of Chicago, in particular.
Wait a second.
Yes.
Let's. That's an interesting point. Homeschooled for high school?
I was homeschooled for high school.
So your parents taught you?
To some degree. So my father, who had used to teach English as a second language, and my mother, who's an artist, were sort of two of my primary teachers. But I took classes just sort of on my own with various graduate students, or took classes sort of outside. So, for instance, my astronomy classes were at the Museum of Natural History. I grew up in New York, and so it was just a train ride away to take afternoon classes there. And it was overall, I would say, a good experience in which I was exposed to a lot of things that...
So this was both elementary school and high school?
Yes, so sixth grade was my last year, and then 7th, 8th grade through high school up until I arrived at college. And it was a sort of curriculum I designed in partnership with my parents. And then the University of Chicago, in particular, is one of those institutions that itself likes to think about education a lot. So coming in here and thinking about what I wanted to do my dissertation about, questions about education came to me, especially because education is something that, especially in a university context, is something we're all in one way or another involved in. And I started being curious about what was going on in education in the 17th and 18th centuries. And one thing I noticed was that there was a proliferation of math textbooks. Now this seemed a little funny because, of course, in any modern education, one of course learns some math. So why was there a growth in this material in the first place? So I started looking into why and when this became part of a regular education, why and when this became an expectation that any of us would be sort of numerate in a way that we consider anybody who is educated to be literate today. And so I started looking into that because I have strong interests in religious history as well, and given that the primary institutions by which anybody who was educated before the 17th and 18th centuries were through religious institutions, what were the religious reactions to this? As I primarily study English and Atlantic history, one of the things I was focusing on England in this regard, and one of the distinctive features of England in this period is that besides being an Anglican or Protestant majority country, and officially an Anglican state religion, it also had a Catholic minority and a Jewish minority which had been readmitted in the 1650s. So it was a nice way to sort of comparatively look at various communities. So that's something that I've been doing for my dissertation. And the thing is that, of course, as somebody who hopes to one day be a professor, one is sort of encouraged to, because as Henry James said, everything connects, there's sort of a lot of riches are reaped when one looks at various areas, because in fact, even though one doesn't know it, one makes connections that only become clear later. So because I was going to look at religious history, because I was interested in religious history, these connections to education sort of open themselves up naturally, and now I'm looking at some of the way the leaders of each of these communities, Samuel Clarke with some of the Anglicans, Chacham David Nito, and the Jewish community, and the way...
Which was Sephardic.
Which was Sephardic, yes.
The periods that you're looking
Correct.
at.
The Jews who had first readmitted back to England in the 1650s under Cromwell were in fact Sephardic merchants, and the community for the first decades of its existence was mostly composed, in fact, of Sephardic immigrants.
By the way, I heard that it may be true that under Cromwell, Jews were at the urging of Menashe ben Israel, who came from Amsterdam to England to try and convince Cromwell to allow Jews back into England, that actually it wasn't until the restoration of the monarchy that Jews really started coming back to England in larger numbers,
Right.
which is actually surprising. You would have thought, well, with the restoration of the monarchy, they would become more strict about keeping
Right.
the Jews out.
Right. Well, one of the funny things about the Restoration period, speaking of it, is that on the surface, the king, Charles, who was king again now, he had never been king, his father had been king.
And had been executed.
Exactly. Is that on the surface there was this attempt to restore everything, but underneath there was an enormous amount of things changing. So the Jews were readmitted then and came back in larger numbers. But also there was this proliferation of coffee houses and a sort of commercial culture, which the Jews were allowed to be part of because the merchants weren't as stuck in the old prejudices as a lot of the aristocrats had been. There was a sort of a dynamic society underneath the attempt to restore. In older England, there was actually a sort of a thriving commercial and literary culture that paved the way partly for a sort of more liberal state and country.
And tolerant.
Yeah, very much so.
And yeah, it's a kind of ironic thing that it's a restoration of a monarchy that should bring about a more liberal culture.
Exactly.
So where are you taking this, your dissertation? Is it just a comparative study? What points do you want to make in your
So the dissertation is going in a few areas. Primarily I'm talking, or sort of attempting to figure out why and when educational change and innovation happens. Back in the medieval and sort of the early modern period, if you will, so 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, a lot of formal educational institutions, say grammar schools or universities, not that there were so many universities, were fairly standardized in terms of what was on the curriculum, which included a lot of either classics or we would consider ancient works, or they put enormous emphasis on grammar and learning of Greek and Latin, or anybody who actually went to a university was even able to get a degree. Of course, any degrees in a degree in philosophy, but that mostly meant theology or law. Mm-hmm. So there was I don't want to say a narrower, but there was less of a selection. Whereas today, one is exposed to an enormous range of areas and can major in any number of things. There was just less of a selection back then. And particularly in grammar schools or elementary schools, for the most part, education consisted of Greek and Latin grammar exercises and sort of religious instruction. So I was curious when this, I would say fairly characteristic of, modern schools, the inclusion of mathematics became part of a curriculum. And so I was looking into why and when that happened. And what I concluded was that a lot of this growth began in the 1600s and the 17th century, but a lot of it was not occurring officially at first within schools. So we think of schools as being places where educational innovation happens or sort of at the forefront of change. But actually, it seemed like this was something that began outside of schools, and then schools became very good at replicating it, copying it, and disseminating it, but were not great at sort of being innovators in this regard. And one can think of in something, for instance, with regard to the internet. So the internet was not invented by a school, but now, of course, everybody who wants to can learn, computer science in schools. But a lot of the sort of the innovations in that regard happen outside.
Well, to use the internet for education.
Right.
Period.
Exactly.
They didn't invent it, but they're trying now to make, educators are trying to make, that's what we do at Yale, a lot of courses, to figure out how we can use the internet and technology to further education in the humanities even.
No, exactly. I myself have occasionally, even though I'm now quite finished with coursework, have occasionally watched some of the lectures on Open Yale courses online, which have been actually great to have because they have both the lecture but also the transcripts, so you can go back and see it or digest it in the format you even want to.
So you don't have to feverishly write down notes because you can always go back and and listen to those points that are of interest to you. So let's go back to the print or manuscript format, which is, I just was curious, in your research, have you found in your work here at the Yale Library anything unique, anything, a discovery of some work that others, I'm just
Yeah.
wondering, in manuscripts and archives or in the Beinecke Library. The Beinecke Library has a lot of materials that deal with England and the history of England. Something that you could use that's really,
Sure.
for your dissertation.
So the first thing that comes to mind is a piece of work at the Beinecke by a 18th century planter and slave master, Thomas Thistlewood. Thistlewood, in addition to being a very cruel man, was also a prolific note taker and writer. So we have boxes and boxes of his work. And he has
What period is this?
He was an 18th century
18th century.
figure, and he lived